There was a widow who kept a mill at the edge of a mountain pass, and a woman who arrived at his door in the first hard snow of winter with 2 children and nothing else, and the life that was built between them in 40 days of cold would outlast everything the valley thought it knew about who deserved warmth. There was a widow who kept a mill at the edge of a mountain pass, and a woman who arrived half frozen and expected to be turned away, and she was not turned away, and that changed everything. The snow began on the 3rd of November, which the miller Edric Voss would later say was earlier than any season he could remember in his 43 years at that altitude. The pass road iced over by mid-morning, the lower trail flooded with drifts before noon, and it was in that narrow window between the last wagon going south and the first real blizzard coming north that Senna appeared at the mill house threshold with her daughter Pell, who was 9, and her son Tam, who was 6, and a satchel that held 4 days of food if she was careful, and the bruised side of her jaw she had covered with the collar of her traveling coat, and the expression of a person who has learned to expect the door to close before the asking is finished. By the way, wherever in the world you're listening from right now, drop it in the comments. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Okay, where were we? Senna was a half-orc woman in a valley that had spent 2 generations convincing itself it had no use for half-orc women. She had her mother's height and her mother's gray-green coloring and the small curved tusks that showed when she pressed her lips together, which she had learned to do often. She had grown up in the lower town where mountain folk and river folk traded, the kind of place that told itself it was tolerant and meant by that, "We will take your coin and pretend not to see your face, and if you are very quiet and very useful and never ask for anything that cannot be reduced to a transaction, we will allow you to remain." She had been quiet. She had been useful. She had married a man named Dorian Ashcroft at 22, a man whose family had money and standing, and whose apparent ease with her heritage had felt at the time like proof that the world could be better than she had been told. It took 4 years to understand that his ease had been performance, and that performance required an audience, and that behind closed doors what he performed instead was control. He was not a violent man in the way the word is most commonly understood. There was the way he described her to his friends as spirited, which was how he named her when she disagreed with him. There was the way he managed the money until she could not purchase a bolt of cloth without explaining herself. There was the way he stood very close when she spoke to anyone outside the household, not touching her, just present, radiating a quiet surveillance she had learned to feel like weather. There was the jaw. She did not dwell on the jaw. She filed it under the same heading as everything else. He had been drinking. She had spoken too directly. It would not happen again. And then it happened again. She had left on the 2nd of November. She had waited until Dorian was in the lower town meeting his solicitor about a land dispute, which bought her 4 hours. She had taken the children, the satchel, and the 23 coins she had saved across 2 years in a hem of her winter underskirt. She had taken nothing else, because everything else was, in some technical and contested sense, his. The solicitor would later help him argue this in great detail, but she did not know that yet when she knocked on Edric Voss's door, because she had not decided to knock on his door specifically. She had decided to cross the pass before the storm closed it, and the storm had disagreed, and the mill house had been the only light she could see. What came next was Edric. He was a broad man, 43 years old, with arms shaped by decades of sacked grain and turned millstones, and a face that had settled into the kind of stillness that is sometimes called calm and is sometimes called absence, depending on what the person looking was afraid of. He had been a widower for 3 years. His wife Maren had died in a fever summer, the sort of loss that arrives so fast there is no ceremony of preparation, only the before and then suddenly the after. The mill house still held Maren's shape in various ways he had not altered. Her wooden spoon hung on its hook by the hearth. Her reading chair faced the window that looked toward the mountain. Her specific arrangement of dried herbs along the kitchen beam had not been touched, not because he was tending a shrine, but because he was a man whose grief had frozen the smaller decisions while leaving the larger ones intact. He still milled grain. He still repaired the wheel. He still kept the fire. He had simply stopped adjusting anything that did not require it, and the result was a house that remembered her without discussing her. He looked at Senna in the doorway. He looked at Pell and Tam. He looked at the sky behind them, which was a color that told him the storm meant business. He said, "Come in a voice that contained no hesitation and no caveats, which is a more extraordinary thing than it sounds when you are a woman who has spent years preparing for caveats. Senna said she was sorry for the trouble. She said they would only need shelter for the night, that she would be gone by morning. Edric said the pass would be closed by morning. She said she could perhaps pay for the inconvenience, that she had a little coin, and she said this in the particular way of someone accustomed to converting their own presence into a transaction before someone else could convert it into an imposition. It is an exhausting mathematics to do constantly, and Edric could hear the exhaustion in it, even if he could not have named its source. He said she could have the back room. He said there was food. He said the coin was not necessary. And then, because he was a man who had learned that continued talking often undoes what plain words accomplish, he stopped talking and turned back toward the hearth and the pot of bean soup with dried rosemary, and let the warmth of the room do the arguing for him. Tam walked in without ceremony, 6 years old, with none of the wariness that Pell wore like a second coat. He walked directly to the hearth and stood before it with his hands out, and said the word warm in a tone of pure animal gratitude that made Edric, who had not smiled at anything indoors in 3 years, very nearly smile. Pell came in more slowly, cataloging the room with a 9-year-old's tactical eye, examining exits and inhabitants and the particular quality of stillness in the man by the fire. She decided, not immediately, but within the first quarter hour, that this stillness was the peaceable kind. She did not say so. She simply stopped standing between Tam and Edric, which was her way of saying it. Senna came in last, and she sat where she was shown, and she ate the soup when a bowl was placed before her, and she said it was very good, and she meant it, and Edric said thank you. And they did not speak again that evening beyond the logistics of where things were and how the stove dampered down for the night. In the morning the snow was 4 feet at the door and still coming. She stayed. The first week was careful. Senna was a woman who had learned to make herself small inside spaces that did not belong to her, and she applied this skill to the mill house with the precision of someone managing a delicate instrument. She rose before the children and before Edric and had the fire built and the water heating before anyone else appeared. She organized the kitchen corner with the quiet efficiency of a person who can read a household's logic and align herself to it without being asked. She swept. She mended a basket that had split at the seam, using thread from her satchel, leaving it back where it had sat with no comment. She apologized whenever Edric came upon her doing anything useful, a reflex she had developed over years with a man who had treated her helpfulness as either a service owed or an imposition depending on his mood, and she had never been able to predict which. Edric noticed all of this. He was a noticing man. He noticed the mended basket. He picked it up, turned it in his hands, set it back. He said, "You didn't have to do that, not as a reprimand, just as an observation." Senna said she was sorry, she would not have presumed, and Edric said, "No, I meant it was kind." The silence that followed was the kind that holds a sentence suspended until both people in the room have absorbed it. By the second week, the children had claimed him somewhat against his will. Tam had appointed himself Edric's shadow during the hours near the mill wheel, not offering help, but providing cheerful commentary on everything he observed. Edric listened. He answered questions when they were answerable. He showed Tam how the wheel's brake worked, which took 9 minutes and required crouching to the boy's height, and Tam watched with the seriousness of someone receiving instruction in statecraft. Pell's yielding was slower and more dignified. She helped in the kitchen. She read from the small shelf of books near Marin's chair, and she watched Edric from a distance until the afternoon she found him struggling to copy a grain order and offered, with enormous reserve, to write it for him as she had better hand. She did have better hand. He accepted. They said very little for the duration of the letter, and at the end he read it and said, "That's exactly right." Something in Pell's posture shifted 3 degrees toward trust. The snow continued. 20 days of it without a real break, then a hard freeze after that. The pass would not open until late March at the earliest. Edric made the 3-mile walk to the village on snowshoes twice a week for supplies and news, and he was careful on these trips to bring back small things he had noticed the children needed: a pair of wool socks in Tam's size, a second candle for the room Pell read in. He did this without announcement. The items simply appeared. Senna noticed and said nothing, because she did not trust herself to say something proportionate, and anything disproportionate would feel like a surrender of something she was still holding very close. She raised the subject of payment on the 15th day with the careful neutrality of someone who has prepared the phrasing in advance. She said she wanted to be clear about what she owed and to make an arrangement. She said she could work. She said her father had run a press and she knew the principles of milling. Edric was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would take a fair share of the milling profit for the week she worked, same as he paid any seasonal hand, and she could call that her board and the children's. He said it matter-of-factly, as a business arrangement clearly stated, and that clarity was its own form of respect. Senna, who had braced herself for either charity that required performance of gratitude or dismissal that required performance of dignity, found herself temporarily at a loss for either posture. She said yes. She said thank you. She said it without elaboration, and Edric turned back to his work, and that was the agreement. She was good at the milling, more than good. She had a practical intelligence for mechanical systems, a patience with repetitive work, and a physical strength that surprised people who had not thought carefully about what it means to carry 2 children and a satchel through a mountain snowstorm. She learned the wheel's rhythms in 3 days. By the end of the 3rd week, she had identified a subtle misalignment in the upper race, costing them approximately 1 part in 8 of their grinding efficiency. She mentioned it diffidently, hedging it as a possible misunderstanding on her part. Edric looked where she indicated and said, "No, you're right." They spent an afternoon correcting it side by side, And when the wheel ran cleaner and they could both hear the difference in the tone of the stone, Edric said, "Good eye," not making a ceremony of it, just saying it. Senna looked at the wheel and not at him, and she allowed herself a moment of something she had nearly forgotten the shape of, which was satisfaction in a thing she had done well. This is the part of the story that is hardest to render, the slow accumulation of days. The way a household that has been holding its breath begins, without deciding to breathe. Tam's nightmares subsided in the second week. Pell began reading aloud in the evenings, first to herself and then, without announcing the change, aloud so that others could hear if they wished. Edric began, around the 22nd day, to sit in the main room after the meal rather than retiring immediately, a solitude he had kept every night before their arrival, a habit that had started as discipline and become like weather, just the permanent condition of after. Now he sat and worked at small repairs, and Senna sewed, and Pell read, and Tam slept with his head on Edric's shoulder in a way that had begun as an accident on the 19th day and had simply never been corrected. On the 28th day, Senna came back from the mill in the early dark and was arrested in the doorway by the sight of the room. Edric and Pell at the table, a book between them, Pell explaining something in the text with the authority of a child who knows more about the subject than the adult listening. The firelight, the warmth of a room that had been, for 3 years, primarily a place where one man endured his evenings. She stood there long enough to feel something gather in her chest that had no clean name. And then she came in and sat down, and the evening continued, and continued after that. She told him on the 31st day. She had not planned to. It came from a remark he made about the village, about a man there who had been asking Edric oblique questions about the woman at the mill, questions Edric had answered with deliberate vagueness. He mentioned it because he thought she should know, standing at the counter with his back partly toward her, giving her the privacy of not being watched while she absorbed it. And Senna said, "He is why we left." She told him about Dorian. She told him not as a complaint, and not as a plea, and not as a bid for his protection. She told him the way a person eventually tells a truth they have been carrying in their body so long it has become physically heavy. She told him about the coin hidden in the hem. She told him about the solicitor meeting that had been her window. She told him about the way control is built from small things, each individually deniable, until the whole structure weighs more than you can lift. She touched the side of her jaw once, briefly, and did not explain the gesture, and he did not require her to explain it. He was very still for the duration of it. The kind of still that is not absence, but attention. When she finished, he did not say "I'm sorry" in a way that was about his own discomfort, and he did not tell her what she should do, and he did not invoke any posture of rescue. He said, "You were right to leave." 3 words, plainly, in the voice he used when he meant something absolutely and without negotiation. She did not cry. She exhaled in a way that was very long and very slow, the kind of exhalation that is the body releasing something it has been tensed around for longer than it knew. He said one more thing. He said, "This house is not his business." And he said it with the specific quietness of a man who is not threatening violence and does not need to, who is simply stating a property line. This is where his land ends. This is where mine begins, and the line does not move. Dorian Ashcroft came on the 43rd day after their arrival. He came on a clear morning after the first thaw had made the pass road passable, and he came polished as he always came when there was an audience to consider. He wore his good coat. He had a companion, a man named Gareth Finch, who served as his solicitor's assistant and carried a leather folder of documents with the expression of someone who believes documents are armor. Dorian had spent the winter being very carefully aggrieved in public. He had spoken at length in the village below about his concern for his children. He had not spoken about their departure or its cause, because there was no version of those specifics that served his image as well as the image of a wronged father. And Dorian had always been skilled at selecting which facts to offer as the complete truth. He knocked on the millhouse door with 3 firm knocks, the kind that announce an expectation of admission rather than a request for it. Edric opened the door. Dorian assessed him with the invisible calculation that certain men perform constantly, measuring whether a person is an obstacle or a prop. He said he was here to collect his wife and children. He said it pleasantly, with the particular pleasantness that is indistinguishable from a threat if you know its owner. Edric said, "Come in if you want to speak with her," not yielding authority, just not performing it either. Dorian came in. Gareth followed with the folder. Edric offered a chair, which was not deference, but the oldest form of home-ground advantage. Dorian did not sit. He stood in the center of the room and described the legal situation as he had constructed it. He spoke of the children's welfare, his standing in the community, the cold fact that Senna had left without agreement. He spoke of the solicitor's letter Gareth was prepared to provide. He was loud without shouting, which is a specific and practiced skill, the voice raised just enough to dominate a room, but not enough to give anyone grounds to call it aggression. Senna came in 20 minutes into this. She had seen his horse at the post from the mill window. She took a few minutes to bring the children to Asa, a broad, practical woman who lived at the bend in the lower road, and who had made her opinions of Dorian Ashcroft known to several neighbors across the winter in terms that were brief and sufficient. Asa took the children without being asked for a reason and said simply, "Stay here until one of us comes for you." Senna walked into the millhouse alone. She was wearing her working clothes, and she had flour on her hands, and she did not stop to clean them, which was not carelessness, but the deliberate choice of a person who has decided not to arrange herself for someone else's comfort any longer. She stood in the center of the room and looked at Dorian with an expression that was not anger, and was not fear, and was not the careful blankness she had once trained onto her face in his presence. It was something clearer than all of those. Recognition without performance. Here is what you are, and we both know it, and I am no longer pretending otherwise. Dorian shifted into the version of himself he used when an audience had not yet sided with him. He said her name. He said he was worried about her. He said all of this had gotten out of hand, and he was sure they could discuss it reasonably. He said the children needed their home, and he said that word, home, the way you say a word that means something else, carrying in his mouth the meaning of the place you belong to and cannot leave without permission. Senna said, "Tell me specifically what you are claiming." This caught him slightly. He had prepared for her to either defend herself or capitulate, and she was doing neither. She was asking him to be precise, and precision was not where his arguments lived best. He turned to Gareth. The folder opened. The documents had accumulated across a winter with a solicitor's ongoing attention. There was a statement of assets. There was a letter from a physician who had not examined Senna, but who was willing to attest to professional concern about her mental condition based on the nature of her departure. There was a claim regarding the children. Senna read each document carefully and completely. When she had read them, she set them on Edric's table without crumpling them, because they were not worth the energy. She said, "The physician has never treated me." She said it without heat, as a statement of fact. She said, "The asset claim covers the furniture, the house, and the accumulated debt on the north parcel, none of which I am contesting." She said, "The children are mine." Dorian's voice went up 2 degrees. He said she was being unreasonable. He said Edric ought to understand, man to man, that a wife and children had a place, and it was not in another man's mill. Edric said, "She was telling you something. Quiet, direct, not loud." But it landed in the room as a different kind of weight than Dorian's volume had been producing. The thing about Dorian was that he had always operated in spaces where his version of events arrived before him, and no one had collected a competing account. He had not reckoned on Asa, who had spent the winter with an ear turned to the mill road. He had not reckoned on Edric's twice-weekly supply trips, and the way quiet men who say little say it in places where it compounds. He had not reckoned on a valley that had been, across those 43 days and the weeks before them, doing something slow and collective, which was revising its estimate of what kind of woman Senna was. They had begun with the standard adjustments: half-orc woman, alone, children in tow, some trouble clearly, keep a measured distance. And then she had milled the grain. And then she had mended the Halverson fence on a day she passed it. And then she had sat with the widow Crane through her bad cold, sending the children for water at half intervals through the night. Small communities have a continuous low-frequency accounting of who contributes and who takes, and that accounting had been running quietly all winter, and by the 43rd day, the balance had shifted in ways Dorian had not had visibility into from the lower town. There were 5 people in the village square that afternoon when the full conversation moved outside. Asa was there, which had not been an accident. There was Brucht, who ran the grain cooperative and who had received 4 sacks of Edric's best winter milling, better than the previous years, a fact he had noted. There was Halverson, whose fence had been mended. There was the woman who ran the dry goods counter. There was a council elder named Torvin, who had come because Asa had sent her son with a message that said simply, "You should probably be here for this." Dorian performed beautifully in the square. He was polished and composed and aggrieved and paternal, and he spoke for several minutes. He made the case for the documents, the case for his standing. He described Senna in terms that were technically restrained and effectively diminishing. The word unstable appearing twice, impressionable once, inappropriate once in reference to her living arrangement. This last word aimed like a small arrow at something it intended to wound without leaving a mark. Senna let him finish. Then she spoke. She did not speak loudly. She spoke with precision and no wasted motion. She said what had happened, in the sequence it occurred, with dates where she could fix them and specifics where she had them. She described the money. She described the physician who had not examined her. She described the 4 hours the land dispute meeting had given her. She described the jaw simply, without framing that apologized for the mention or dramatized it, just the fact of it. This happened on this night. Here is what preceded it. She said, "I left because my children needed me to leave." She said, "I stayed here because the storm closed the pass." She said, "I worked for my board and I earned it, and Edric Voss will tell you what the work was worth, and the grain cooperative can tell you about the milling, and Asa knows what the children looked like when they arrived and what they look like now." Asa said, without ceremony, "They're healthier." Left it there. Bruck said the winter milling had been the best in 4 years, and he would put that in writing. Torvin asked Gareth Finch, who was looking at the folder with the expression of a man whose armor had begun to feel decorative, who had prepared the physician's letter, and on what basis. Gareth began to explain, became confused in the explanation, and stopped explaining. Dorian spoke again. He became louder. He spoke about tradition and property and the nature of agreements. He pointed out, with a sharpened edge returning under the pleasantness, that certain kinds of women had always used their circumstances as an excuse for conduct the community ought to examine carefully. He said certain kinds of women, and everyone in the square understood the specific calculation in that phrase, the reaching for the prejudice that had always been the deepest tool in the chest. Torvin said, "You have made a claim for the children. The claim is unsupported by examination, and the supporting documents are flawed on their face. You have no legal hold on her person. If you want to contest custody before the Valley Council, you are welcome to do so in 30 days with proper documentation. Until then, I suggest you go home." She said it with the brisk finality of someone closing a ledger. Dorian stood in the square for a moment. He looked at the faces around him and did the math he was always doing. And for once, it did not come out in his favor. He looked at Senna. She met his eyes without looking away, and there was nothing in her face for him to use. No residual softness, no fear, no apology. Just the clear recognition of a person looking at something she has already put behind her. He left. He did not look back. Gareth followed with the folder. The snow had mostly gone from the square by then, and the mud of early spring was showing through in pale strips, and the light was the gray gold of late mountain afternoon. Tam came running from Asa's house because he had been watching from the window and decided enough time had passed. He ran to Senna and was caught, and Pell walked out behind him with the dignity she maintained always, and Senna held them both in the square and did not think about anything for a moment except the specific physical fact of them. Edric stood slightly apart, not absent, just not inserting himself into what did not require him. Asa said to Edric quietly, as the square resumed its usual business, "You did well to stay quiet when you needed to." Edric said he had not done anything. Asa said, "Exactly." She went back inside. The walk back to the mill was quieter than usual. The pass road was soft with melt, and the mountain above still held its white. But the lower slopes had the tentative color of a season preparing to change, the birch beginning to suggest leaves in the faint bronze at the tips of branches. Tam walked between Edric and Senna and held a hand of each without making a statement about it. Pell walked ahead, reading, which was either an act of trust in the path or her way of not showing she was relieved. The evening that followed was ordinary in most of the ways that matter: the fire, the meal, the table, the lamp. Senna was very quiet, the particular quiet of someone who has said something large in public and needs to let the body catch up with what the voice did. Edric was quiet too, which was just Edric. The children were not quiet. Later, when the children were in bed and the house had that specific late evening texture of cooling wood and low fire, and outside dark and inside lamp, Edric said, "I'd like you to stay." He said it looking at his hands, which was not evasion, but the habit of a man who finds direct speech easier than direct looking when the subject is his own feelings. He said, "Not for the season." He said, "If you wanted to." Senna said, What does that mean, specifically? He looked up then. He said, I think you know what it means. And there was something almost gentle in the difficulty of it. A man who had not said anything like this in 3 years of frozen evenings, saying it now with the plain vocabulary available to him, because plain was what he had. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about gentleness and what it had cost her to trust it before. And she thought about what trust asked of her now. And she thought about 43 days and the wool socks and the basin of water in the mornings and the good eye and the way he had stood in the mill doorway while she fixed the race alignment and had not once suggested she was doing it wrong. She thought about what her mother had told her once, that you know a person's real measure not by what they do when someone is watching, but by what they do in the 43rd hour of an ordinary difficult task with no audience. She had watched. She knew the measure. She said, There is a chair by that window that I have not sat in. Edric said, I know. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Maren had that chair. He said, I don't think she would want it to be furniture. It was an enormous thing to say, and he said it simply, and it stayed in the room between them, and neither of them rushed past it. Senna said, I am not her. He said, I know who you are. She moved to the window chair then, not dramatically, not as a gesture of claim, but the way you sit in a chair you have been offered that you think might be yours, tentatively, with the weight not yet fully committed, and she felt the worn cushion and the angle of the window and the way the lamp reached that corner of the room, and she thought, this could be a place I sit. The spring came in the 2nd week of April, all at once the way mountain spring arrives, apologetic and sudden and overwhelming. The birch went from suggestion to full leaf in 5 days. The mill wheel ran full and fast with the meltwater. Orders came down from the high villages that had been waiting all winter, and Senna and Edric worked the mill in shifts, and Pell kept the household with a 9-year-old's precise authority, and Tam was underfoot in the way that is either a nuisance or a blessing, depending on your current need for evidence that the world contains joy. And mostly it was the blessing kind. Edric went down to the village on a Tuesday, which was not one of his usual days. He was gone most of the day. He came back with the mill orders fulfilled, 2 sacks of seed grain, a new chisel, and a very small thing wrapped in cloth that he set on the kitchen counter and did not refer to. Senna looked at it. He said, You don't have to open it now. She opened it. It was a ring, bone and silver wire, modest and handmade, worked by the village jeweler who was known for pieces that would outlast the century. It was not the ring from her first marriage, which had been finer in material and had meant nothing it promised to mean. This one was smaller and was exactly what it was. She held it in her palm for a long time. He said, I asked Pell first. He said it matter-of-factly, and the fact of it, that he had asked the 9-year-old first, that he had understood instinctively that Pell's trust was both separate from Senna's, and prior to any claim he wanted to make, lodged somewhere in Senna's chest with the precision of something fitting into a space that had been shaped for it. She said, What did she say? He said, She said I would have to learn to knock before entering a room. He said it with the slight alteration around his eyes that was his version of a smile. He said, I told her that seemed fair. Senna said yes. She said it without the long reasoning aloud she had once believed necessary before any choice, without the calculation of risk, without the old reflex of converting her own desires into a transaction first. She said yes because the word was true, and she had recently been practicing the radical simplicity of saying true things. He put the ring on her finger, and they stood in the kitchen with the spring light coming through the window above the mill. And neither of them spoke for a moment, and the wheel ran on outside with the meltwater, and the house held them. The wedding was in May. Asa brought food in quantities that implied she had been planning this for some time. Brucht brought wine from the valley's southern cooperative. The Halversons came, and several of the high village families who had been trading with the mill all winter and had drawn their own conclusions from the quality of the grain. Torvin, the council elder, stood very straight and was brief and correct. The jeweler came and was delighted. Pell stood beside Senna with the composure of someone who has decided that this specific outcome is acceptable and, having decided it, commits completely. She did not cry. She wore her good dress. She watched Edric with the expression of a person who has checked the structure and found it sound and is ready to live in it. Tam cried, but for uncomplicated reasons. Asa gave him a sweet roll, and then the sweet roll was gone, and this seemed to him a small injustice in an otherwise excellent day. Senna was present for the ceremony in the way that was not absence, but its opposite, complete attention, attending to every detail with the fullness of someone who has come from a long way to be exactly here. And then, at some point in the late afternoon, when the party had moved to the mill yard, and the light was the heavy gold that only comes in a mountain May, she began to sing. She had not sung in 4 years. She had stopped because Dorian had told her once that her singing was too much, which was his way of telling her that she was too much, and she had folded it away and put it somewhere she could not easily reach. But she had carried it with her in the hem of herself, along with the 23 coins, and now she unfolded it. She sang something her mother had sung, a song in the old half-orc mode that moves differently than the valley songs, with a different rhythm in the lower register, and people stopped talking without quite deciding to, and the mill yard went very still, and the mountain above was clear in the May light, and it was simply her voice, which had always been there, which was hers. Edric listened. He stood near the mill wheel with his hands at his sides, his face in the expression that was either calm or fullness. It was genuinely hard to tell the difference. Beside Marine's wooden spoon on its hook inside, and beside the new ring on Senna's finger, and beside the children who were currently both of theirs in the way that needs no paperwork, and beside the corrected mill race and the repaired basket and the mended fence, the song found its place and stayed. This is what it comes to, in the end. Not the grand reversal, not the documents defeated, and the square abandoned by a polished man with a leather folder. Those things mattered, but they are not the center. The center is this. A house that had been frozen in the after of grief began, through 40 days of small things and honest labor, to make room. Grief does not end. It learns to sit beside what comes after, which is not replacement, but something more honest, a rearrangement. The wooden spoon on its hook and the ring on the finger. The chair by the window finally occupied. The song unfolded and given back to the air. A heart does not hollow itself out to hold new love. It simply grows around it, the way a house adds a room without forgetting the ones before. The way roots keep spreading into soil they have always been growing toward. The door opens and the warmth within reaches into the cold and says, "Come in, not for the night, if you wanted to stay."